The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower overlooked a city that never truly slept, its lights stretching toward horizons that promised anonymity and consequence in equal measure. Alana stood near the window, her reflection ghosting across the glass, a dark-skinned woman in a charcoal suit that spoke of competence rather than decoration. She had been brought here as a translator, nothing more. Her role was to facilitate communication between men who measured power in territories and silence, men who built empires on foundations she tried not to examine too closely. She had learned not to ask questions. In the 3 months since the translation agency assigned her to these particular clients, she had developed a practiced neutrality, a professional distance that allowed her to convert Russian into English and back again without absorbing the weight of what was being discussed. But distance, she was learning, was a luxury that could evaporate in a single moment. The meeting had been tense from the beginning. 2 factions, 2 sets of carefully groomed men in expensive suits, sitting across from each other with the kind of stillness that suggested coiled energy. On one side sat representatives of the Zakharov organization, their leader a man named Victor whose smile never quite reached his eyes. On the other side sat Konstantin Belitsky and his inner circle. Konstantin was the kind of man who commanded attention without demanding it. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with the build of someone who understood that physical strength was merely one tool among many. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his face carried the kind of weathering that spoke of decades spent making decisions that left marks invisible to everyone but himself. He rarely spoke during these meetings, allowing his second-in-command to handle most of the negotiation, but when he did speak, the room reorganized itself around his words. Alana had translated for him before. His Russian was the Moscow variant, educated and precise, and he spoke in complete thoughts that required no embellishment. She appreciated that. It made her job cleaner. The negotiation today concerned shipping routes and percentages, the dry language of business layered over realities she chose not to translate beyond their literal meaning. She stood slightly behind and to the left of Konstantin's position, her notepad in hand though she rarely needed it, her attention focused on the voices and the careful dance of dominance playing out across the table. Viktor Zakharov was speaking, his tone conciliatory, when the door opened. Alana glanced up, her translator's instinct cataloging the interruption. A younger man entered, perhaps 30, with the kind of aggressive confidence that hadn't yet been tempered by genuine consequence. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and he moved with the swagger of someone who believed his own mythology. This was Dmitry Zakharov, Victor's nephew, and Alana recognized him from a previous meeting where he had been notably absent from the actual negotiations, relegated to waiting in an outer room like a child not yet ready for adult conversations. Victor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he said nothing as Dmitry took an empty seat beside him. Konstantin's face remained neutral, though Alana noticed the slight shift in his posture, a fractional adjustment that somehow conveyed complete awareness. The meeting continued. Dmitry said nothing for several minutes, but Alana could feel his attention moving around the room, assessing, measuring. When his gaze landed on her, it stayed there longer than was comfortable or appropriate. She kept her expression professional, her focus on the words being spoken, but she felt the weight of his stare like a physical presence. Then, during a pause in the conversation, Dmitry leaned forward and spoke directly to her in accented English. "You are very beautiful. Perhaps when this boring business is finished, you would join me for dinner. There is an excellent restaurant I know, very exclusive." The room went silent. Alana felt the attention of every man present shift toward her, toward Dmitry, toward the sudden breach in the careful protocol that governed these interactions. Her translator's training had prepared her for many situations, but not this. She opened her mouth, searching for a response that would deflect without escalating, but before she could speak, Konstantin moved. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stood, the movement smooth and deliberate, and said something in Russian, his tone conversational but carrying an undercurrent that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. Alana translated automatically, her voice steady despite the racing of her pulse. "This meeting is concluded. My associates will be in touch to reschedule when everyone present understands the basic requirements of professional conduct. Viktor Zakharov's face flushed, and he began to speak rapidly, apologizing, attempting to salvage the situation. But Konstantin was already buttoning his suit jacket, his attention already elsewhere. He looked at Alana once briefly and said in English, "Come." It wasn't a question. Alana gathered her notepad and followed him toward the door, acutely aware of the chaos erupting behind them in rapid Russian as Viktor turned on his nephew. Konstantin's men fell into formation around them, and they moved through the outer office and toward the elevators with the kind of coordinated precision that suggested they had walked away from volatile situations before. In the elevator, descending toward the parking garage, Konstantin spoke without looking at her. "You will not return to your apartment tonight. Someone will collect your necessary belongings. You will stay in a secure location until I determine this situation." Lana found her voice, though it came out steadier than she felt. "I don't understand. I can just go home. I'm nobody. He was just being inappropriate. It's not. You became somebody the moment he spoke to you in that room." Konstantin's gray eyes finally met hers, and she saw no anger there, only a kind of weary calculation. "You became a symbol of disrespect. You became something that was noticed. And men like Dmitry Zakharov do not accept." The elevator doors opened onto the parking garage, and Alana was guided toward a black sedan, one of 3 identical vehicles waiting with engines already running. She got in because there seemed to be no alternative, because the gravity of the situation was beginning to settle over her like a weight she couldn't shrug off. The secure location turned out to be a penthouse apartment in a building across the city, a place decorated with the kind of expensive anonymity that suggested it was used for temporary housing rather than actual living. Alana was shown to a bedroom, told that someone would arrive within the hour with clothing and toiletries, and informed that she was not to leave or make any phone calls without clearance. She sat on the edge of the bed, her professional composure finally cracking, and tried to process how her evening had transformed from routine translation work into something she couldn't yet name. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number in English. "Your belongings are being collected. Make a list of anything essential that might be missed. Someone will monitor this number for your response." Alana stared at the message for a long moment, then began typing, her fingers moving automatically even as her mind struggled to catch up with her new reality. The first 3 days felt like existing in suspension. Alana occupied the penthouse apartment with a strange sense of dislocation, moving through rooms that were comfortable but impersonal, eating meals that appeared at regular intervals, delivered by quiet men who never quite met her eyes. She had her laptop, some of her clothing, her books. She had everything except freedom and explanation. On the 4th day, Konstantin himself arrived. He knocked, which surprised her. She had half expected him to simply enter, to treat this space as his own since it undoubtedly was. But he waited until she opened the door, and when he entered, he moved to the living room and sat in one of the armchairs with the air of someone making a deliberate choice to appear non-threatening. "I understand this is difficult," he said without preamble. "You have questions, I will answer what I can." Alana sat across from him, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. "How long? Until I am certain you are not in danger. The Zakharovs have agreed to discipline Dmitry, but agreements mean less than actions. I need to see compliance before I risk your safety." "Why do you care about my safety?" The question came out sharper than she intended. "You could hire someone else." Something flickered across Konstantin's face, too quick to identify. "You were placed in danger because of my business in my presence. That creates responsibility. Also, you are not just a translator. You are very good at what you do. You listen not only to words but to what lies beneath them. That is rare." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was an observation delivered in the same tone he might use to note that a particular tool was... But Alana felt something shift in her chest anyway, some small recognition that he had actually noticed her skill rather than simply her utility. "I need to work," she said. "I have bills, responsibilities. The agency will drop me if I just disappear." "Your agency has been informed you are on an extended assignment abroad. They are being compensated at 3 times your normal rate. Your bills are being handled. Your rent is paid. You are not abandoned, Alana." The use of her name, the first time she had heard it from him, created an unexpected intimacy in the conversation. She studied his face, trying to read beneath the careful control he maintained. "And what do you get from this arrangement? Besides a competent translator held hostage, you are not a hostage." His voice carried an edge now, the first real emotion she had heard from him. Hostages have value because someone wants them returned. You are here because returning you to your normal life right now would be irresponsible given the circumstances my world created. Your world, Alana repeated. The world where a stupid comment from an entitled man means I lose my freedom for an indefinite period. Constantine leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. Yes, my world. A world I did not invite you into, but a world you entered nonetheless when you accepted contracts to translate for organizations like mine. You understood what kind of work you were doing. Perhaps not the full implications, but enough to know it was not translating poetry. He was right, and she hated that he was right. She had known. She had chosen not to examine too closely, had told herself that facilitating communication was neutral, that she was not responsible for what was being communicated. But neutrality, she was learning, was another luxury that could be revoked. What happens now? She asked. Now you wait, and while you wait, I have work that requires translation, confidential work that cannot be sent to an agency. If you are willing, you continue to work here where you are safe. You are compensated appropriately, and when the situation stabilizes, you return to your life with enough saved to take time to decide if you wish to continue this kind of work or choose another path. It was logical. It was fair in its way. It was also a gilded cage, however reasonably presented. But Alana was practical enough to recognize when her options had narrowed to a single viable path. I'll work, she said, but I want your word that when you say it's safe. No extensions, no revisions, no discovering new reasons to keep me here. Constantine held her gaze, and for a moment she thought she saw something like respect in his expression. You have my word. When it is safe, you are free to go. And Alana, I keep my word. That is one of the few things that still means something in my world. He stood, preparing to leave, but paused at the door. You will have documents to translate tomorrow. Someone will bring them in the morning. If you need anything, the number you have been using is monitored constantly. Ask. After he left, Alana sat in the silence of the apartment and tried to map the boundaries of her new existence. She was trapped, yes, but the trap came with assurances, with compensation, with a kind of respect she hadn't expected. And Constantine himself remained an enigma, a man who wielded power but seemed to carry it like a burden rather than a trophy. The weeks that followed developed their own. Alana worked, translating documents that ranged from financial records to correspondence, all of it handled with encryption and security measures that reinforced just how far outside normal business practices she had stepped. The work was challenging, requiring not just linguistic skill but contextual understanding, and she found herself becoming invested despite her circumstances. Constantine visited regularly, sometimes to deliver new materials, sometimes. These visits became conversations, careful exchanges that never quite crossed into personal territory, but revealed small details nonetheless. She learned that he had been born in Moscow, but raised in New York from age 12. She learned that he read extensively, that he had opinions on architecture and music, and the psychology of loyalty. She learned that he had a younger sister who lived in London and knew nothing of his actual business, believing he ran import-export operations and investment firms. She thinks I am boring, he told Alana one evening when he had stayed longer than usual, accepting a cup of coffee she had offered. She thinks I spend my time looking at spreadsheets and attending tedious meetings, and I do sometimes. The boring parts are real. They are just not all of it. Do you wish she knew the truth? Alana asked. Constantine was quiet for a long moment. No, her ignorance is a gift I give her. She has a normal life. She married a professor. She has children. She worries about school admissions and mortgage rates and whether her daughter's cough requires a doctor. These are good worries, clean worries. I would not trade them for her knowledge of what I actually do. Alana heard the weight beneath his words, the accumulated cost of a life built on secrets and compartmentalization. Don't you get tired, carrying all of that alone? Every day. He met her eyes over the rim of his coffee cup. But tired does not mean I stop. It means I am still human enough to feel the weight. That is something, at least. The honesty startled her. In their weeks of careful conversation, this was the first time he had offered something unguarded, something that suggested vulnerability beneath the control. She found herself wanting to know more, to understand how a man ended up in this position, carrying power he described as burden rather than privilege. But before she could ask, His phone vibrated. He glanced at it, and whatever he saw there caused his expression to close down, the momentary openness vanishing behind practiced neutrality. "I have to leave. There is a situation requiring attention." After he left, Alana stood at the window, looking out at the city lights, and realized with some surprise that she had begun to look forward to his visits, to the conversations that felt like carefully negotiated truces against loneliness. It was dangerous, she knew, to find connection with a man whose world operated by rules she could barely comprehend. But humans were not built for isolation, and Constantine, for all his power and the darkness surrounding him, was the only person she spoke to with any genuine exchange. The shift happened gradually, too subtle to identify in any single moment. Constantine's visits became longer. Their conversations deepened. He asked about her background, her family, her decision to become a translator. She told him about growing up in Chicago, about her Nigerian father and African-American mother who had raised her to believe in education and self-sufficiency, about her love of languages and the way translation felt like solving puzzles that connected worlds. "You are good at building bridges," Constantine observed. "Between languages, between people who would otherwise never understand. That is a rare gift. Sometimes bridges get you into trouble," Alana replied. "Sometimes they lead you places you never intended to go." "Yes," he agreed quietly, "but without them we are all trapped on our own islands, alone with only our own thoughts for company. I think that is worse." She studied his face as he spoke, noticing details she had overlooked before. The small scar near his left eye, the way his hands, strong and capable, never quite relaxed. The tiredness that lived in the lines around his mouth, a weariness that suggested years of sleep never quite sufficient to erase accumulated strain. "Constantine," she said, using his name for the first time in direct address rather than translation. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes. Do you ever regret it, the choices that led you here?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a roughness she hadn't heard before. "Regret is complicated. I regret the necessity of certain actions. I regret the impossibility of alternatives that might have existed in a different world. But the fundamental path, I was 12 when my father was killed over a debt he could not pay. I was 14 when I understood that in the world we inhabited, power was the only reliable protection. I was 17 when I made my first serious choice, the one that set everything else in motion. Could I have chosen differently? But that boy who made that choice cannot be separated from the man who lives with its consequences. Regretting him would mean regretting my own existence, and that seems pointless." Alana absorbed this, the matter-of-fact delivery of a life shaped by violence and necessity. "I'm sorry about your father. It was long ago, but thank you." He paused, then added, "You are the first person I have told that story in many years. Perhaps the first person who has asked not out of curiosity about my power but genuine interest in my experience." "You're more than your power," Alana said softly. "You're a person carrying impossible weight. That matters." Something in Constantine's expression shifted, a crack in the carefully maintained facade. He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, and for a moment she thought he might say something that would change the careful equilibrium they had maintained. But instead he stood, creating distance, retreating behind professional courtesy. "It is late. I should go. Sleep well, Alana." After he left, Alana sat in the dark, her heart beating harder than the conversation warranted, and recognized the danger she was in. Not from Dmitry Zakharov or rival organizations or the violence that lived in the shadows of Constantine's world. The danger came from within, from the growing connection she felt toward a man whose life was built on foundations she could never accept, whose choices she could never fully condone, but whose loneliness called to something in her own carefully guarded heart. 6 weeks after the conference room incident, Constantine arrived with news. "The Zakharovs have concluded their internal discipline. Dmitry has been sent to oversee operations in Prague. Victor has provided assurances, backed by actions, that you are not to be approached or threatened in any way. I believe it is safe for you to return to your normal life." Alana should have felt relief. Instead, she felt a complicated tangle of emotions she couldn't quite name. "So I can go home?" "Yes, whenever you wish. Your apartment has been maintained. Your agency is expecting your return. The arrangements we discussed regarding compensation have been finalized." The word hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them voiced. Alana stood, moving to the window, looking out at a view she had memorized over 6 weeks of carefully constrained existence. What if I don't want to go back to exactly how things were? Behind her, she heard Constantin move, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. What do you want? She turned to face him. He stood several feet away, his hands in his pockets, his expression carefully neutral in the way she had learned meant he was feeling something he didn't want to reveal. I want to keep working, not for the agency, for you, here or in an office, whatever makes sense. I want to keep translating, but I also want... She paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. I want to keep talking to you, not as translator and employer, as people. Alana. Her name and his voice carried warning and want in equal measure. You know what my life is. You know what proximity to me means. You would be safer returning to your world, keeping distance, building a life that does not intersect with the choices I have made. I know, she said quietly. I know it's not safe. I know it's not smart. I know all the logical reasons to walk away. But these 6 weeks, isolated and trapped as they were, have also been the most meaningful conversations I've had in years. You see me, not just as a translator or a woman or a risk to manage, but as a whole person. And I see you too. The person beneath the power, beneath the control. I don't know what that means or where it goes, but I know I'm not ready to just walk away and pretend this time didn't matter. Constantin closed the distance between them in 3 strides, and for a heart-stopping moment Alana thought he might touch her, might cross the physical boundary they had maintained through all their careful conversations. But he stopped just short, close enough that she could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between what he wanted and what he believed was right. If you stay, he said, his voice low and rough, if you choose this, you cannot unchoose it easily. My world does not allow for casual connections. People close to me become targets, become leverage, become complications in ways you cannot fully anticipate. I can offer you work, yes. I can offer you compensation and interesting challenges, but anything more than that comes with costs I am not certain you understand. Then help me understand, Alana challenged. Stop protecting me from information and treat me like an adult capable of making informed decisions. Tell me the truth. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw the calculation behind his eyes, the weighing of risks and benefits and consequences. Finally, he spoke. It means you become someone I protect. It means you become visible in ways that attract attention. It means you live with security considerations and restrictions you have not experienced before. It means you accept that there are parts of my work you will never know about, actions I take that I will never discuss with you, choices I make that you may find morally complicated or reprehensible. It means you build a relationship with someone who cannot promise safety or normalcy or any of the things that healthy relationships are supposed to provide. But what can you promise? Alana asked. Constantin's expression softened fractionally. Honesty, within the limits of what is safe for you to know. Respect for your autonomy, even when my instinct is to control for your protection. Genuine connection with someone who sees your value not as decoration or status, but as actual partnership. And my absolute commitment that as long as you choose to be part of my life, I will use everything at my disposal to ensure your safety, even if that means making decisions you disagree with. It wasn't a romantic. It was a business proposition presented with emotional honesty, a clear-eyed assessment of what he could and could not offer, and somehow that made it more meaningful than any flowery promise could have been. This was Constantin stripped of pretense, offering her a place in his life with all its complications laid bare. Alana took a breath, steady and deliberate, making a choice she knew would alter everything that came after. I want to stay. I want to work with you. And I want to see where this connection goes, whatever that means, with full awareness of the costs you've described. Constantin closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, she saw relief and concern tangled together. Then we move forward carefully. You return to your apartment, but with security I arrange. You work on translation projects, but with protocols to protect your independence. We spend time together, but we build slowly, giving you chances to reassess and step back if you need to. This is not a trap, Alana. This is a door that remains open even as you walk through it. I understand, she said, and then because the moment seemed to call for some acknowledgement of the shift occurring between them, she added, Thank you for being honest, for treating me like a partner rather than a problem to manage. You were never a problem, Constantin said. You were a complication I did not anticipate, But sometimes the most important things in life arrive as complications we never planned for. The first months of their new arrangement unfolded with careful deliberation. Alana returned to her apartment, though she quickly became aware of the discreet security presence that now surrounded her building. She accepted translation contracts directly from Konstantin's organization, working from a secure office space he provided. The compensation was generous, the work challenging and engaging. But more than the professional arrangement, there was the personal dimension that grew in the spaces between work. Konstantin began inviting her to dinners, carefully chosen restaurants where they could talk without constant interruption. They attended a concert together, sitting in a private box while a string quartet performed Shostakovich, and Alana watched Konstantin's face as the music unfolded, seeing genuine pleasure in his expression, a momentary escape from the weight he carried constantly. They talked. Long conversations that stretched into early morning hours, covering everything from philosophy to favorite foods, from childhood memories to opinions on art and literature. Konstantin was well-read and thoughtful, capable of engaging ideas with genuine intellectual curiosity. Alana found herself challenged and stimulated in ways that had nothing to do with translation or languages, but there were also moments of sharp reminder about the reality of his world. The evening when Konstantin arrived late to dinner, his composure perfect but tension visible in the set of his shoulders, and apologized for his tardiness without explaining. The night when Alana noticed bruises on his knuckles and understood without asking that sometimes his work required physical presence in situations that turned violent. The conversation that ended abruptly when his phone rang and his entire demeanor shifted from relaxed companion to controlled authority. He never hid these moments from her, but he also never explained them beyond necessary acknowledgement. And Alana learned to accept the boundaries, to understand that choosing connection with Konstantin meant accepting the existence of a world she could not fully access or control. 3 months into their relationship, such as it was, they had their first serious argument. Alana wanted to visit her parents in Chicago, a normal trip home for a long weekend. Konstantin insisted on security accompanying her, on coordinating with his contacts in Chicago to ensure her safety. Alana resisted, seeing it as excessive as imposing his world onto her family relationships. "They are my parents," she said, frustration sharp in her voice. "They live in a quiet neighborhood in Hyde Park. They have nothing to do with your business or your world. I am not bringing armed men to their house for a casual visit." "You may not be bringing my world to them," Konstantin replied, his tone measured but firm. "But you are connected to me now, and that connection travels with you whether you acknowledge it or not. If someone wanted to send me a message, hurting you would be effective. If someone wanted leverage, your family would be vulnerable. This is not paranoia, Alana. This is practical assessment of real risk. So what? I never see them again without a security detail. I never have a normal interaction with the people I love. That's not living, Konstantin. That's just existing." His expression tightened, and she saw real anger flash across his face before he controlled it. "You think I do not understand the cost? You think I enjoy knowing my choices limit your freedom? I would give anything to offer you a normal life, to let you visit your family without concern, to exist without calculated risk assessment of every movement. But I cannot change reality through wishful thinking. The world I inhabit has rules and consequences, and pretending otherwise does not protect you, it endangers you." They stared at each other across the distance of her living room, both breathing harder than the conversation warranted, both carrying frustration and fear in equal measure. Finally, Alana spoke, her voice quieter but no less determined. "Then help me find a middle ground. Not armed guards at my parents' house, but reasonable precautions. Not prison, but... I will not sacrifice every normal relationship to be with you, Konstantin. That price is too high." Something in his expression shifted, the anger draining away to leave only weariness. "You are right. I overcorrected. I let my fear for your safety dictate terms without considering your actual needs. We will find a compromise, discreet security that your parents need never see, coordination that does not intrude on your time with them, protection that honors your autonomy." The argument ended not in capitulation, but in genuine negotiation, both of them bending to find sustainable middle ground. And afterward, Konstantin said something that revealed more vulnerability than Alana had yet witnessed from him. "I am not accustomed to caring this much. to having someone whose safety matters more than strategic advantage. It makes me reactive, overprotective in ways that are not helpful. Please be patient with me as I learn how to balance what I feel with what is actually necessary. Alana stepped closer to him, close enough to see the gray in his eyes, the fine lines around his mouth, the humanity beneath the carefully constructed authority. I'm patient, but you have to trust me to be smart about my own safety. You have to believe I understand the risks well enough to make reasonable choices. This only works if we're partners, not if you're constantly managing. Partners, Konstantin repeated, as if testing the word's weight. Yes, I can do that. I will do that. And he did. The Chicago trip happened with security so discreet Alana's parents never noticed, and she returned feeling like she had reclaimed some piece of her own life without sacrificing her connection to Konstantin. It was a small victory, but it mattered, establishing precedent for how they would navigate future conflicts. The shift from careful partnership to something deeper and more intimate happened not in a single moment, but across accumulated instances of trust and vulnerability. Konstantin shared more about his past, about the specific choices that had led him into his current position, about the weight of leadership and the loneliness of power. Alana talked about her own fears and desires, about the tension between the safety of her previous life and the complicated richness of. One evening, 6 months after she had chosen to stay, they were in his private study, a room Alana had been invited into only a handful of times. It was lined with books, real ones rather than decorative spines, and filled with objects that suggested a life beyond business. A vintage chess set, a collection of fountain pens, framed photographs of landscapes rather than people. Konstantin was sitting in a leather chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking more relaxed than Alana usually saw him. She was curled on the opposite end of the couch, her own wine glass balanced on her knee, and they had been talking about nothing in particular, the comfortable conversation of people who no longer needed agenda to justify time together. "Can I ask you something?" Alana said, the wine making her bold enough to venture into territory she normally avoided. "Have you ever been in love, before all this, before you became who you are now?" Konstantin considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. "Once, when I was 19, her name was Irina. She was studying literature at university, and she thought I was studying business, which I was in a sense, though not the kind she imagined. We were together for 8 months. She wanted to meet my family, to understand my life beyond our carefully contained time together. I realized I could never give her that, never let her see the reality of what I was becoming. So I ended it, cleanly and completely, and I have not allowed myself that kind of connection since." "That must have been lonely," Alana said softly. "Lonely, yes, but also clear. Relationships built on deception fail eventually. Better to avoid them entirely than to hurt someone with revelations they cannot accept." He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Until I found myself wanting connection more than I wanted safety from complication. You already know what I am, Alana. You know the darkness I carry, the choices I make, and you stay anyway. That is something I have never experienced before." Alana set down her wine glass and moved across the space between them, settling beside him on the arm of his chair. It was the closest she had been to him, physically, since all of this had begun. She could feel the warmth of him, smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with whiskey and something uniquely his own. "I stay because I see more than the darkness," she said. "I see the man who reads poetry in Russian late at night. I see the brother who protects his sister's innocent view of him. I see the leader who carries responsibility for hundreds of people's livelihoods and safety. I see someone who is trying every day to balance impossible demands with some shred. That's who I'm choosing, Konstantin, not the power or the danger, but the person beneath it all." He set down his own glass and reached up, his hand cupping her face with unexpected gentleness. "You see too much. You give me too much credit for humanity I am not certain I still possess. Then let me remind you," Alana whispered. "Let me be the mirror that shows you who you are beyond the role you play." Konstantin pulled her down into his lap, and when he kissed her, it was with the pent-up longing of months of careful restraint, with tenderness that contradicted everything about his public persona, with a vulnerability that made Alana's heart ache even as it soared. She kissed him back, pouring into it all the complicated feelings she had been carrying, the fear and desire and determination to choose this impossible connection, despite every logical reason to walk away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Konstantin rested his forehead against hers. "This changes things. This makes you more vulnerable, more visible, more intertwined with everything I am. Are you certain?" "I'm certain," Alana said firmly. "I'm choosing you, I'm choosing us, whatever that means, whatever it costs." "Then I choose you too," Konstantin murmured. "And I will do everything in my power to make that choice sustainable, to protect you from the worst of my world while still honoring what we build together." It was a promise, delivered with the same certainty he brought to every commitment he made. And Alana believed him, not because she was naive about the challenges ahead, but because she had seen him keep his word even when it was costly, even when easier alternatives existed. The months that followed brought new dimensions to their relationship. They became partners in the fullest sense, Alana's insight and perspective influencing Konstantin's decisions in ways that surprised both of them. She pushed back when she thought his approach was too harsh, offered alternative strategies that sometimes proved more effective than brute force solutions. He listened, genuinely engaged with her input, and their discussions became a kind of crucible where his experience and her moral clarity forged approaches neither would have found alone. But the reality of his world also imposed itself in ways that tested their connection. There was the night Konstantin disappeared for 3 days without explanation, returning exhausted and closed off, and Alana had to accept that sometimes his work required absence she could not question. There was the evening when a rival organization made a move that put several of Konstantin's operations at risk, and Alana watched him make decisions that resulted in consequences she preferred not to examine too closely. "I need you to understand something," Konstantin said to her after that particular crisis had been resolved. "I will not burden you with details of actions I take that would make you complicit or morally compromised, but I also will not lie to you. There are parts of my work that are brutal, that involve choices between bad options and worse ones. I make those choices so that people under my protection, including you, can live with less immediate threat. But that does not make the choices clean or justifiable by conventional morality." Alana met his eyes, seeing the weight he carried in the lines of his face. "I'm not asking you to justify yourself to me. I'm asking you to let me choose, fully informed, whether I can live with the man you are, including the parts that make difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. Can you do that?" "I can try," Konstantin said quietly, "but understand that my instinct is to protect you, even from knowledge of my own actions, especially from that knowledge." "I don't need protection from truth," Alana replied. "I need honesty even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." It was a negotiation they returned to repeatedly, finding and refining boundaries between necessary transparency and burdening Alana with details that served no purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. Konstantin shared the broad strokes of crises and conflicts, allowed her to see the strategic considerations without drowning her in operational specifics. Alana learned to accept that some silences were gifts rather than evasions, that sometimes not knowing protected her in ways she might not fully appreciate. A year into their relationship, Viktor Zakharov requested a meeting. The request came through formal channels, and Konstantin's team spent 2 weeks vetting its legitimacy and preparing for every possible complication. When Konstantin told Alana about it, he was clear about his concerns. Viktor claims he wants to discuss collaborative opportunities in shipping logistics. It may be genuine, but it may also be an attempt to assess our operations or probe for weaknesses. And there is always the possibility that this is connected to Dmitri, to the original incident that brought you into my protection. "Do you want me there?" Alana asked. "As translator or just as support?" Konstantin looked at her, and she saw the conflict in his expression. "I want you. Which means I want you nowhere near this meeting. But I also value your insight, your ability to read subtext and motivation. So I am torn between protecting you and including you in something that matters to our shared interests." "Then let me choose," Alana said. "Give me the information I need to assess risk and trust me to make a decision." They spent the evening going over everything Konstantin's intelligence had gathered about Viktor's current position, about Dmitri's activities in Prague, about the potential angles and agendas that might be in play. And after absorbing it all, Alana made her decision. "I'll come, not because I'm fearless or because I think the risk is negligible, but because we're partners and this matters to our future." And because if there is any connection to what happened a year ago, I want to face it directly rather than hiding while you handle it alone. The meeting took place in a neutral location, a private room in an upscale restaurant with security from both organizations discreetly positioned. Victor arrived alone, a calculated gesture of respect or a clever misdirection, depending on interpretation. He greeted Constantine formally, then turned to Alana with an expression that seemed genuinely apologetic. "Miss Alana, I owe you an apology, long overdue. My nephew's behavior was inexcusable, and the position it put you in was a failure of my supervision and family discipline. I hope you have not suffered lasting harm from that incident." Alana kept her expression neutral, falling back on translators' training to present professional courtesy without warmth. "I appreciate the acknowledgement, Mr. Zakharov. The situation was resolved, and I have moved forward." Victor nodded, then shifted his attention to Constantine, and the conversation moved into business matters. Alana translated when necessary, though both men spoke passable English and used her services more for nuance than basic communication. She listened not just to words but to tone, to the careful dance of power and positioning that characterized these interactions. Midway through the discussion, Victor brought up Dmitri directly. "My nephew has requested permission to return from Prague. He claims to have learned from his mistakes and wishes to reintegrate into family operations here. I wanted to inform you directly, as a courtesy, before making any decision about his request." Constantine's expression remained neutral, but Alana felt him tense fractionally beside her. "I appreciate the courtesy. What is your assessment of his claims?" "Dmitri is young and ambitious and not as smart as he believes himself to be," Victor said bluntly. "But he has family, and family obligations are complicated. I am inclined to deny his request for the foreseeable future, both because I do not trust his judgment and because I value the working relationship we have been rebuilding. But I wanted you to hear this directly from me, not through channels or rumors." It was, Alana realized, a gesture of respect and transparency, Victor acknowledging Constantine's legitimate concerns while also being honest about family pressures he faced. Constantine seemed to recognize this as well. "I value your directness, Victor. If Dmitri does return eventually, I trust you will ensure he understands the boundaries that must be maintained. Some offenses, once committed, create permanent constraints on future behavior." "Understood. He will not be a problem for you or for Miss Alana. You have my word." The meeting concluded with tentative agreements about shipping coordination and information sharing, the kind of careful collaboration that allowed both organizations to benefit without requiring deep trust. As they left, Constantine's hand rested briefly on Alana's lower back, a small gesture of connection and reassurance. In the car afterward, he turned to her. "Your assessment," Alana considered carefully before answering. "I think Victor was being genuine. I think Dmitri is a problem he wishes would disappear, and he's managing family politics while trying to maintain business relationships. I don't think this was a setup or a probe. I think it was exactly what it appeared to be, a courtesy notification and an apology he felt obligated to deliver." "I agree," Constantine said, "which is why I accepted it, but I also..." People's motivations can shift quickly when circumstances change. "Always the strategist," Alana said with a slight smile. "Always," Constantine agreed. "It is how I have survived long enough to meet you, though I will admit having you there, your presence and your insight made the meeting less isolating. I am not accustomed to having a partner in these situations. It is significant." Alana reached across the space between them and took his hand. "We're in this together. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Constantine lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Together," he agreed, "even when that means navigating complications neither of us anticipated." 2 years into their relationship, Alana faced a choice that would define the boundaries of what she could accept. One of Constantine's longtime associates, a man named Alexei who managed operations in the port district, had been discovered providing information to federal investigators. It was a betrayal that put dozens of people at risk, that threatened operations Constantine had spent years building, that violated the fundamental rule of loyalty that held his organization together. Constantine told Alana about it because he had promised transparency about decisions that affected. "Alexei has forced my hand. His betrayal cannot be ignored without sending a message that disloyalty is acceptable. I have to respond, and the response will be severe." Alana felt her stomach tighten, understanding what he was saying without needing explicit details. How severe? He will disappear. Completely. No one will see him again, but the message will be understood by everyone who needs to understand it. This is not a choice I make lightly, Alana. Alexei has worked with me for 15 years, but some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. She stood and moved to the window, looking out at the city lights, trying to process the reality of what he was telling her. This was different from abstract knowledge of his world's brutality. This was specific, immediate, a decision made with her knowledge and involving someone whose name she knew, whose face she could recall from past meetings. I need you to understand something, Alana said without turning around. I can accept that your world has different rules than the one I grew up in. I can accept that you make hard choices in impossible situations. But I need to know that you still feel the weight of those choices, that you haven't become so numb to violence that it no longer costs you something. Can you tell me that? Behind her, Konstantin was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a rawness she rarely heard. It costs me, every time. Every decision like this one takes something I cannot get back. I do not sleep well afterward. I see faces I have erased from the world and I carry them with me. I tell myself it is necessary, that the alternative would cost more lives, more suffering. But necessary does not mean painless, and justification does not mean absolution. So yes, Alana, I feel it. I wish I did not have to. Alana turned to face him and saw the truth of his words in his expression, in the lines of exhaustion and moral strain that marked his features. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough to see the gray in his eyes, the human being beneath the authority. Then I will stand beside you, she said quietly. Not because I approve or because I think it's right by any absolute measure, but because I choose you, including the parts that carry impossible burdens. Because I believe you when you say you still feel the cost of what you do. Konstantin pulled her into his arms, holding her with an intensity that suggested gratitude and grief tangled together. You give me more grace than I deserve. Maybe, Alana murmured against his chest. Or maybe I'm just choosing to love someone complicated, someone real, someone who lives in a world where easy answers don't exist. That's my choice, Konstantin. I'm making it with my... The Alexei situation was handled, and Alana never asked for details beyond what Konstantin volunteered. She learned to live with the knowledge that the man she loved made decisions that resulted in permanent consequences, that his hands were not clean by conventional standards. But she also saw the weight he carried, the genuine struggle to balance loyalty to his organization with whatever remained of his conscience, and she chose to believe that struggle mattered, that it kept him from becoming the monster he might otherwise have been. Their life together found a sustainable rhythm, a balance between the extraordinary and the ordinary. They had quiet dinners and argued about movies and traveled to places where Konstantin's reputation did not follow. They worked together on translations and strategy, Alana's perspective consistently valuable in ways that surprised both of them. They built something that resembled normalcy within the constraints of his impossible world. But the constraints remained, ever-present reminders that their life was built on unstable foundations. Alana still traveled with security, still modified her movements to account for risks she would never have considered in her previous life. Konstantin still disappeared for days when crises demanded his attention, still made decisions he could not fully share with her. They learned to navigate these realities, to create space for genuine connection within the boundaries imposed by his position. On their second anniversary, Konstantin took Alana to a cabin in upstate New York, a place owned through so many shell companies that it could not be connected to him, a refuge from the constant surveillance and strategic considerations that governed their normal existence. They spent 3 days in complete isolation, no phones, no security detail within sight, just 2 people existing without the weight of his world pressing down on every moment. On the final evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set over the lake, Konstantin said something that revealed how far they had both traveled. I spent 30 years believing I could not have this. Connection, intimacy, someone who knew the truth and stayed anyway. I built a life around that belief, organized everything to function without vulnerability or genuine partnership. And then you walked into a conference room, and everything I thought I knew became insufficient. Alana leaned her head against his shoulder, comfortable in the silence they had learned to share. I spent my life believing I wanted safety, predictability, a relationship with someone whose job I could explain at dinner parties. And then I met someone who saw me as more than decoration or convenience, who challenged me and respected me and needed me in ways I had never experienced. Turns out what I wanted and what I needed were not the same thing. "Are you happy?" Konstantin asked, a question he rarely voiced directly. Alana considered it honestly before answering. "I am challenged and occasionally frightened and frequently exhausted by the complexity of our life together. But yes, I am happy. Not in a simple way, not without cost or complication, but genuinely, deeply happy in ways that simple safety never would have provided." Konstantin kissed the top of her head, a gesture of affection he had learned to offer freely with her, whatever walls he maintained in the rest of his life. "Then, we continue, together with all the complications and costs and impossibilities, because what we have built matters more than the easier alternatives we walked away from." "Together," Alana agreed, watching the last light fade from the sky, knowing that tomorrow they would return to the city, to the security and strategic considerations and careful balance of their actual existence. But for this moment, they were simply two people who had found each other across impossible distances and chosen to stay despite every logical reason to part. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Hey, loves. If you're still here, if you stayed with Konstantin and Alana through all of this, then you felt it too, didn't you? That pull between what we know is right and what our hearts decide anyway. This story was never about glorifying dangerous men or forbidden romance. It was about two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chose connection over safety, honesty over comfort. It was about seeing someone's darkness and deciding their humanity matters. Konstantin isn't a hero. Alana isn't naive. But they're real in the ways that matter, flawed, trying, carrying weight they didn't ask for and making choices that cost them something every single day. I wanted to write something that honored the complexity of loving someone whose life doesn't fit into neat categories, someone whose past shaped them in ways that can't be erased, only carried with more or less grace. And I wanted to write a woman who chose with her eyes open, who demanded respect and honesty and partnership even in impossible circumstances. What did you think? Did their journey resonate with you? Did you believe in their connection? I'd love to hear what you felt, what moments hit you hardest, whether you think they made the right choice or if you would have walked away. Thank you for spending this time with me, for letting me tell you a story about complicated love and impossible choices and the human need for connection that persists even in the darkest spaces. You're amazing for listening all the way through. Really, that means everything. Until next time, take care of yourselves, okay? All my love.